pleasure to get to know him. He's sort of a do-it-yourself author person. You know, he's really started out in his first book, Canada in Haiti. That's the first time he appeared in Kelowna, and he spoke to us about Haiti. This was just after the 2004 coup in Haiti, where Canada, the famous picture of the Canadian soldier holding his M16 and securing the Toussaint Louverture airport so that the U.S. plane could fly the democratically elected president of Haiti out of the country. That was the first time we heard Yves, and then he came back with another book, the Black Book of Canadian Policy, Foreign Policy. And it's sort of an overview of the what our government has been up to. And he's got, his third book was Canada in, Israel and Canada, Building Apartheid. So Yves has a wide-ranging topic tonight, and I want you to think of any questions you want to, if you want to specifically narrow in on any specific topic, to save those for the end. So I'll give those. I'll give it over to Yves, and welcome him to Kelowna.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone for coming out. Echo here. So basically, what I'm going to talk about is why Canada lost the bid for the Security Council seat back in October. Lost the bid to Portugal, despite immense advantages on Canada's side, a history of having won the bid for the Security Council, much bigger economy, much bigger population. The Harper government spent a couple $100,000 wooing UN diplomats, buying them the best maple syrup money can buy, and still wasn't able to convince them to vote for Canada. The maple syrup is good, but the policy is not so good. And that's the thesis of the talk, is that Canada lost the bid for the Security Council seat because they pissed off too many countries in the international community. And the Harper government has been orienting its foreign policy to the most extreme sectors of the Conservative Party base. The right-wing evangelical Christian Zionists, right-wing Jews, the mining executives, the military-industrial complex, and the old cold warriors. And they went so far in that direction that there was a backlash in the international community. And it must be noted that the UN is not a body that lends itself towards being particularly moralistic, right? So you have to go pretty far. You got to be pretty extreme to be to lose out of the UN in that context. And we should see this as a victory, right? All of those of us who believe in international solidarity and the idea that all people are equal should see the loss of the Security Council seat as a victory. And the list of examples of the Harper government being offside with the international community is unfortunately very long. So you are in for a very long and boring talk coming up.
I hope not.
I'll do my best to make it not so long and not so boring. So, refusing to agree to the human right to water, or refusing to sign the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, blocking a consensus at the Rotterdam Convention in terms of banning asbestos, being obstructionist in different forums for climate negotiations. Repeatedly, the Harper government received the Fossil of the Day award from environmental groups for doing the most in terms of obstructing climate negotiations. At a meeting in Bangkok last year, after a Canadian proposal to scrap Kyoto as the basis for negotiations, the delegates from the Global South got up and walked out. So there is numerous examples of the Harper government being offside in these different international forums. One issue that definitely contributed to lost bid the Security Council was the Harper government's Israel no matter what policy. Despite the fact that there is a extreme right-wing government in Israel that in 2006 killed 1,200 people in Lebanon, destroyed much of southern Lebanon, launched a 22-day campaign against Gaza 2 years ago that left about 1,400 Palestinians dead. Despite that, in the case of Lebanon, Harper referred to it as a measured response. In the case of Gaza 2 years ago, Canada was the only country to vote against the United Nations Human Rights Council, calling on Israel to stop its campaign against Gaza. According to Israel's Foreign Affairs Minister, Avigdor Lieberman, quote, "It's hard to find a country friendlier to Israel than Canada these days." Avigdor Lieberman, it must be noted, is someone who immigrated to Israel at the age of 20 from Moldova, and yet has called for the expulsion of the indigenous Palestinian citizens of Israel. So this is someone who represents a real right-wing face, racist face of Israeli policy. And the examples of the Harper government's pro-Israel positions are quite numerous. Just about 10 days ago, at something called the Forum for the Future, which brings together countries from the G8, as well as North African and Middle Eastern countries, the Harper government blocked a final paragraph in the final declaration on Palestinian rights. An official from Qatar said, quote, "There had been an agreement. However, the Canadians insisted on not including a paragraph on Palestine." And this was despite lobbying from other G8 countries even. Canada was the first country to pull out of the Third World Conference Against Racism about 2 months ago. They had been the first country to pull out the Second World Conference Against Racism back in 2009. Israel was the second country to pull out of the Second World Conference. And that was because at the First World Conference Against Racism, supporters of Israel dubbed criticism of Zionism, of Israeli policy, as anti-Semitic. We have a situation in the context of the bombing campaign against Gaza 2 years ago. Governments, citizens around the world condemned what was taking place in Gaza. The government in Venezuela expelled Israel's ambassador, cut off diplomatic relations, but Israel didn't need to worry because the Harper government was there to help out. And Canada actually took over Israeli diplomatic relations in Venezuela. And so today in Venezuela, Canada actually is Israel, diplomatically speaking. In terms of more concrete support, we know that recently Harper government officials have said that its charities in this country can openly raise money for organizations involved in the occupied territories, Israeli organizations involved in the settlements, right? So you can get a tax credit from the Canadian government for donating to charities that are contravening international law, that are building settlements. So you get the Canadian taxpayer pay a third, up to 40% of that cost. Another form of Canadian support for Israeli policy is the role they're playing in building a Palestinian security force to, on one hand, combat the rise of Hamas, and on the other hand, to oversee Israel's occupation. Canada's been heavily involved in this Palestinian security training that's been under the direction of a U.S. general. Until just recently, it was U.S. General Keith Dayton. And according to Canada's ambassador, John Allen, the goal of this security system reform is, quote, to ensure that the PA, the Palestinian Authority, maintains control of the West Bank against Hamas. So Canada is explicitly involved in this security training to sow division within Palestinian society. And that's been the policy since Hamas won those elections back in 2006, where Canada was the first country to cut off. If it's something specific, I'll answer, but otherwise we can leave it there.
No, it's specific. I'm just wondering how come this meeting was called to hear about Canada's relationships in the world, and especially on Haiti. Are we here to hear this, or is this Israel bashing here? Because that's all I've heard from the beginning is anti-Israel. What about the rest of the world and Canada's relation to the rest of the world?
I'm coming to the rest of the world. I'm starting with the, gotta start somewhere, right?
Right.
Maybe I should have started, Haiti first and Honduras second, but it is what it is. I'm focusing on there's a lot of focus on Israel because I think that actually contributed a great deal. I mean, I don't know what to say beyond. I'm getting to Haiti. I'm getting to Honduras. Getting to Venezuela. Getting to the Congo. Mining. So bear with me. I mean, if you hold Israel's dispossession of Palestinians close to your heart, well, that's I think too bad. So the Canada's involved in the security training of a Palestinian security force. Is something called Operation Pretis. Right? Has anyone in this room heard of Operation Pretis? No, it's Canada's second largest military deployment after Afghanistan. That sounds a little bit more impressive than it is. It's actually only 18 Canadian troops that are involved in the West Bank. But it is taking most of the $300 million Canadian aid program to the Palestinians. Most of it's going to this security reform that is being led by a U.S. general. Canada is one of 3 countries training the Palestinians in Jordan at a school, a security school the Americans built after invading Iraq, which they trained tens of thousands of Iraqi forces to then go back to Iraq and oversee the occupation there. And Canada is one of 3 countries involved in training the mission in the West Bank as well. And according to Dayton, the U.S. general, the Canadian troops are particularly valuable because the American troops have restrictions on their travel in the West Bank, whereas the Canadian and the British troops do not. There's actually more Canadian troops than any other. There's 18 Canadian troops, 10 American, I think it was six Brits, and I think maybe at one point there was 1 Turkish soldier. To get a sense of what this training mission is about, during the demonstration, or during the bombing against Gaza 2 years ago, there were demonstrations in the West Bank. Those demonstrations were put down by this Palestinian security force. There have been a number of polls that have shown that alongside Canada-US training this Palestinian security force, Palestinians' attitude in the West Bank towards their right to demonstrate, their right to dissent against the authority has dropped. Right? So what Canada is involved in doing is building a security force similar to what you see in Egypt, right, where it keeps in place an illegitimate authority. And it's important to note that colonial powers always want domestic force to do as much of the security work as possible. The British in India had Indians that did most of their security work, right? Likewise, the Israelis want Palestinians, compliant Palestinians, to do as much of their dirty work as possible. What's somewhat distinct in this instance is the fact that it's third parties that are doing this training. So it's the U.S. and the U.S. and Britain that are leading this. Though the Shin Bet, the Israeli intelligence, are also involved in vetting the Palestinian candidates. And the reason I belabor the question of Operation Pretis is because it's not mentioned. Right? None of the dominant media ever discuss it, despite the fact it's receiving hundreds of millions of dollars from the Canadian government. It's the second biggest deployment. RCMP is involved. Foreign Affairs is involved. The Canadian Border Services are involved. A number of arms of the Canadian state are involved in this process. The pro-Israel, pro-empire policy of the Harper government extends to the region as a whole, most notably vis-a-vis Iran. So while the Turks and the Brazilians were trying to have a negotiated solution to Iran's nuclear energy program and possible nuclear weapons program, the Harper government has taken a different tact. And according to the Toronto Star a year ago, quote, military action against Iran still on the table, Kent says. Canada's Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister, Peter Kent. Canadian naval vessels have been patrolling off the coast of Iran for the past few years, running provocative maneuvers. We know there are a few thousand Canadian troops occupying a country that borders Iran. We know that about 3 years ago, the Can West reporter at the UN in New York said that there was a division of labor between the European, a couple of European countries, the Brits and the French, mostly the US and Canada, on the question of Iran. The British, French, and US focused on the sanctions campaign, while Canada focused on Iran's human rights record as a way to demonize and destabilize the regime in Iran. And there's a lot of very legitimate criticisms of Iran's human rights record with regards to repression, with regards to treatment of women. However, the Harper government, while they repeatedly attack Iran's human rights record, say very little about the human rights record of Saudi Arabia, which is more repressive, which is a worse, a more misogynist system in place. And I have a Canada-Iran Google News update that I receive daily. And in response to these attacks about Iran's human rights record, the Iranian government has responded by attacking Canada's human rights record. Repeatedly. Repeatedly. I've never seen it reported in the Canadian media, but Press TV and other Iranian outlets talk about these comments and resolutions that Iran puts forward at the UN about Canada's human rights record. They regularly talk about the murdered and missing Indigenous women in this country, right? The 530 or more murdered and missing Indigenous women over the past couple of decades. They regularly talk about First Nations issues more generally. After the police attacks at the G20 protests in Toronto this summer, the Iranian officials condemned Canada for its brutal police tactics. In both instances, in the Canadian criticism of Iran and the Iranian criticism of Canada, I think both of the criticisms are legitimate. Now, in both instances, I think what's motivating those criticisms is not some great humanistic moral outrage, but rather power politics. But I do think underlying in both instances, there's some legitimacy. And this campaign against Iran is being waged under the guise that Iran is building possible nuclear weapons, right? Possibly building nuclear weapons, which, if you care about the environment, if you want humanity to live, long into the future, you obviously oppose nuclear weapons. You don't want anybody building more nuclear weapons. But the hypocrisy of the Harper government's position is really too much. Back in September, a number of Arab countries put forward a resolution calling for a nuclear-free Middle East. According to Bloomberg News, there was 3 countries that opposed that at the International Atomic Energy Agency. Canada was one of those 3 countries. Because, of course, Israel doesn't have a possible nuclear weapons program, but has an extensive known nuclear stockpile today. Likewise, a number of times at the International Atomic Energy Agency over the past few years, the Harper government has abstained on IAEA resolutions calling for Israel's nuclear weapons to be put under IAEA controls. So you see this real hypocrisy in the different positions vis-a-vis Iran and then Israel. And a big part of the Canada-Israel relationship, the growth of that relationship, is that the Harper government sees I think, the Harper government, with it's very military-minded, right? It's very close to the military-industrial complex in this country, and and even domestically, it would prefer to put money into prisons rather than daycare, right? It sort of sees, that's the ideology that's sort of driving this government, and I think the Harper government really is impressed by Israel as a highly militarized society that has a very successful military-industrial complex and a successful spin-offs, right? Much of the high-tech economy in Israel that's been done quite well over the past few years, that's based upon public subsidies into military companies, which then have other economic benefits, because Israel has really perfected different military technologies and methods against the Palestinians, right, against other countries in the region. And now, according to Peter MacKay, who was just in Israel 2 weeks ago on a tour, Canada's defense minister, he said in his press release 2 weeks ago that Israel was helping Canada out in Afghanistan, right? That Canada was putting to use these technologies that Israel used against the Palestinians in Afghanistan. Most notably, of course, the drones that the Canadian military bought from an Israeli company. And so this militarism, I think this militarism of the Harper government is an important component. Back in 2007, Harper referred to Russia as aggressive. Then Peter MacKay went to the Ukraine and said Canada was going to provide a counterbalance to Russian influence in that part of the region. And now with the F-35 fighter jets that the Harper government wants to buy, that would cost somewhere between 16 and 21 billion. Now I just saw another report saying it might actually even be more than that. The way they've justified it is that Russia is about to attack Canada. Yeah. And I heard Kelowna is the first strike.
Start digging your bomb shelters.
So if you didn't know, we're right back in the Cold War, right? Right back. And it's about justifying militarism, right? It's about sending some public money to some corporations that benefit you, and I think there's also this ideological component of fear, of controlling people via fear that this justifies or enables. Obviously, the most extreme example of Canadian militarism today is in Afghanistan, right, where it's about 3,000 Canadian troops. They're occupying country for, in one way or another for a decade now. And just a few days ago, a week, 10 days ago, there were the CBC reported on the Joint Task Force 2 Canadian Special Commando, who said that his superiors were pushing them to commit war crimes. People may have seen that in the CBC and in the Globe and Mail. We know that the Canadian Joint Task Force 2 Special Commandos are involved in those nighttime assassination raids, where they go to a Afghan family's house that's been dubbed, Taliban supporter by some intelligence, and they bust down the door in the middle of the night and they shoot to kill. We know that Hamid Karzai, the puppet president in Afghanistan, has condemned those nighttime assassination raids for contributing to hostility to the foreign forces. And the extent of the militarism of the Harper government, it extends all the way to a situation where 200,000+ people die because of an earthquake. The response of the Harper government to the earthquake in Haiti, just over a year ago, the terrible earthquake that was, something towards between 230 and 300 and some thousand people dead. The response was to send 2,000 Canadian troops. At the same time they sent 2,000 Canadian troops to Haiti, the heavy urban search and rescue teams based in Calgary, Toronto, numerous other cities, that were readied to be sent were not. According to Lawrence Cannon, they weren't sent because, quote, the government had opted to send Canadian armed forces instead. So we have these units that are specialized in getting people out of rubble, specialized in providing water, basic medical care after a natural disaster, and they weren't sent because we see, and I say we, not necessarily people in this room, but we, meaning the decision makers in Ottawa and Washington, see the majority poor in Haiti as a security threat, as a danger, despite the fact that they had just been victimized by this horrendous earthquake. And this seeing Haitians as a threat, as a danger, it has a long history, which we could get into later on at the end, going, I think, all the way back to the Haitian Revolution. But in its most recent phase is tied to the February 2004 coup d'etat, where the Canadians, Americans, and French overthrew Haiti's elected government, actually took the elected president and dumped him in a Central African Republic. People saw that there were elections recently in Haiti, I guess 2 months ago now. There were elections. I'm sure many people saw that there was a lot of reporting on the fraud, the ballot box stuffing. But before any vote was cast in Haiti, these elections were a complete fraud. Right? Famille Lavalas, the political party of the ousted president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, was not allowed to participate. Famille Lavalas is by far the most popular political party in Haiti today. So the media discussed the ballot box stuffing, but rarely did they discuss the context of these elections that were completely fraudulent from the get-go. And these are elections paid for by the Canadian taxpayer, the American taxpayer. $7 million in the Canadian case, and I think about $14 million from the Americans. So they were, you know, the main promoters of these elections were the so-called Friends of Haiti, the Canada, the U.S., and France, who were better understood maybe as the torturers of Haiti. And well, going back to the security elements, since the earthquake, Canada, the Harper government has announced more than $50 million in aid to the police and prison system in Haiti. Right? So there's still 1 million people living in tents, or towards 1 million people living in tents in Port-au-Prince. And what they focused on, or a major proportion of the aid, going to building up the repressive apparatus of the Haitian state. And this fits into the militarization of aid. This fits into the UN occupation of Haiti, which, you know, why are there UN troops in Haiti today? Right? Was there a civil war in Haiti? Right? Was I not paying attention to the news that day or that week? No, there was no civil war in Haiti. There was a couple hundred former military that were paid by some sectors of the Haitian elite and the CIA to come over from the Dominican Republic to attack the elected government of Aristide, to provide the pretext for the military invasion, American, U.S., or American, Canadian, French military invasion. So there's this is really a continuation of liberal party policy in Haiti. But it's a policy that's grim, right? It's about supporting the Haitian elite. It's about militarization of society. People see the cholera outbreak in Haiti. Most people familiar with it. Now we're over 4,000 people dead from cholera. Do people see where cholera came from? Anyone?
Nepal. A guy from the UN soldier from Nepal.
Yeah, UN soldiers from Nepal, right? The Nepalese contingent had a new deployment of Nepalese troops. Some of them had a cholera strain. Cholera hasn't been seen in Haiti in recorded history. So the UN troops brought it into Haiti, but the backstory to that is that a private company operating the UN base in the Artibonite Valley, where the Nepalese troops were, had just underbid another private company to manage the base, get the contract. And what they were doing is they were taking the excrement of the troops, the sewage, and just dumping it into a river that people were drinking from. Right? That's how valueless Haitian life is to the UN occupation. Right? And now, you know, the public health system, sanitation system in Haiti is such that cholera is going to be there for years, right? Decades, you know, possibly. So I don't think that the Harper policy towards Haiti necessarily contributed a great deal to losing the Security Council seat, maybe with some Caribbean countries. But I think that the sort of the militarization of the aid effort is sort of reflective of this larger vision that definitely contributed this sort of pro-military vision of the Harper government. Now, one part of the world that definitely contributed to the lost Security Council seat is the Harper government's demonization, attacks, attempts to undermine the leftward shift taking place among a number of governments in Latin America, right? This push away from American domination, push away from capitalist domination being pursued by many social movements and governments in Latin America. And the Harper government has really gone after the government leading the charge, the government of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. They've claimed that Chavez is anti-Semitic, or the government's anti-Semitic. They've, just the head of the Canadian military, Walter Nattingzink, had a piece in the Canadian Military Journal in the summer saying that the Venezuelan military was politicized. Right, which the head of the Canadian military is claiming another military is politicized. You're making a political accusation. Do you not see the? Anyways, that's a logic lost on the head of Canada's military. Peter Kent, the deputy foreign affairs minister, went to Haiti last year and only met with opposition figures, didn't meet with anyone from the elected government, and he said this: democratic space within Venezuela has been shrinking. And in this election year, Canada is very concerned about the rights of all Venezuelans to participate in the democratic process. This is what Venezuela's ambassador to the Organization of American States responded with. I am talking of a Canada governed by an ultra-right that closed its parliament for various months to evade an investigation over the violation of human rights. I am talking about torture and assassinations by its soldiers in Afghanistan. This was at the same time as the Harper government prorogued parliament. They had the audacity to go to Venezuela and say, you're democratically deficient. And just on that note, the Chavez government, the Chavez-led movement, has won about a dozen elections and referendums over the past 12 years. Lost one. So this is actually a government movement that has a very high level of electoral legitimacy. Another part of this Harper government hostility towards the leftward movement in Latin America was their tacit endorsement of the coup in Honduras in June of 2009. Manuel Zelaya, who the elected president in Honduras, had been pursuing some very modest social democratic reforms, increased the minimum wage, had joined the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas, which is the Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador, I think, is an associate member, and some Caribbean countries alliance to sort of break away, Latin American solidarity and break away from capitalist domination. And Zelaya, the elected president of Honduras, was overthrown by the military. Every country in Latin America condemned the coup, including the right-wing governments in Colombia and Mexico. The Harper government eventually did condemn the coup. They were always the last, and they always did it with a caveat, right? We oppose this coup, but Zelaya did something that contributed to justifying the military's involvement. Canada was the only major donor to Honduras that didn't cut off any assistance. So the European Union cut off money after the coup. The World Bank, even Washington, which tacitly supported the coup, cut off some assistance, but the Harper government refused to cut off any money, even though Honduras was the second major recipient of Canadian aid in the Caribbean and Central America. And the Harper government even continued the military training assistance program with the Honduran military. It's not extensive. It's about 6 or 8 Honduran troops that came to Canada to be trained. But by not cutting off a training program with the military that ousted elected government, I think is sort of symbolic of the tacit support that the Harper government gave to this coup. And a number of reports about the lost bid at the Security Council said that Brazil was lobbying against Canada for the Security Council, and it was Brazil that provided the safe haven for Zelaya when he returned to Honduras. He lived in the Brazilian embassy for 2 or 3 months when he returned to Honduras as a way to try to break the coup. So I think, without a doubt, the Harper government's policy in Latin America, opposition to leftward shift, contributed to hostility. And there's been a number of forums, not the Organization of American States, where Cuba is excluded, but other forums where all the countries of the hemisphere are brought together except for 2, the US and Canada. And I think that's reflective of the fact that increasingly people in Latin America see Canada as tied in or similar to the ugly American, the historic imperial bully in the hemisphere. Changing regions.
Can I follow up on that for a second? Did Brazil redirect Latin American support to Portugal then for the Security Council seat?
That's what some of the reports were saying, that there was an attempt to push towards Portugal. It's all secret, so we don't, like the who voted which way, we don't know. It's just it's all conjecture.
Right.
Another region which contributed to a minimum of 1 lost vote, but possibly more, was the Harper government's policy to vis-a-vis the Congo, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo. A Vancouver-based mining company, First Quantum, that had a major mining concession in the Katanga region of the Congo, had its concession taken back by the Congolese government. A Congolese government that has been trying to get a bit better control over the country's vast mineral resources. A lot of the concessions the mining companies have were acquired in the context of the foreign invasion, Rwanda and Uganda in the late 1990s, and then there was a multi-country war until like 2003. So a lot of these concessions were acquired in quite questionable circumstances, including First Quantum's. There's a UN report in 2002 that cited the First Quantum concession as being acquired in questionable circumstances, bribes and others. And the response of the Harper government to this attempt to reacquire First Quantum's concession was to use debt forgiveness to the Congo to put pressure on the Congolese government to negotiate with First Quantum. This is debt that the Congo incurred during the time of Joseph Mobutu, right, the dictator for multiple decades and stole hundreds of millions. Debt that was incurred during the multi-country war from 1998 to 2003. So this was odious debt that the majority of impoverished Congolese should not have to repay, and the Paris Club of Debtor Nations was prepared to write off this debt. Right, it was very far in the process. And this is what the Congo's information minister, Lambert Mende, had to say. Canadian officials, quote, have a problem with what's happened with a Canadian company. The Canadian government wants to use the Paris Club of debtor nations in order to resolve a particular problem. This is unacceptable. In another article, they say, we refuse to be blackmailed by Canada, says the DRC. So the Harper government's willingness to use the Congo's debt forgiveness to put pressure on the country to improve the situation for Canadian Mining Company, I think is reflective. You've missed most of the good stuff. I think it's reflective of the extent to which the mining sector is influencing Canadian foreign policy. Right? There's a real growth in the mining sector in this country that has played they've played a growing role in determining Canadian foreign policy, and taking such a bold and extreme position on the Congo's debt forgiveness to protect a Canadian mining company, I think is reflective of this shift. The last numbers I saw was that there are 7,813 Canadian mining concessions abroad. About 60% or more of the world's mining companies are listed on Canadian stock exchanges, primarily Toronto and Vancouver. Back in 1989, Canadian mining companies had about 600 million invested in Africa. Today, that's at 21 billion. Right? So we hear about how China is buying up Africa. Right? Rarely do we hear about Canada is buying up Africa, and on a per capita base, to a much greater extent than China. And the mining sector is really dependent upon, or has benefited from, extreme free market capitalism. Right? The growth of the Canadian mining sector in Africa and Latin America is tied into those international monetary fund structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and 1990s that opened up countries' resource sector to foreign exploitation. Right? In the case of Mexico, it's really clear that Mexico made changes to its constitution and laws in the lead up to the North American Free Trade Agreement that expanded the possibility of foreign mining companies. The ejido system, the communal property system that were changed, that allowed for foreign mining companies, and I don't know exact numbers, but basically there was basically no Canadian mining companies in Mexico in 1993, 1994, and today it's something like 375. Right, just an explosion. That's happened all around Latin America and Africa, and so these mining companies, the mining executives, they need this extreme free market capitalism, right? One of the first things that governments do, such as Venezuela or other governments in the hemisphere, when they start pursuing nationalistic or social democratic reforms, is to gain greater control over their natural resources, increase royalty rates, nationalize concessions. So I think that's played an important part in the shift, the right-wing shift in Canadian foreign policy. This need of Canadian miners, which is a great Canadian success story from a capitalist perspective, right? It's we're the leaders in that from a capitalist perspective, and these Canadian mining companies are involved in ecologically and socially destructive projects all around the world, right? Pretty much you name a country now, and there's an example of a Canadian mining company involved in some sort of destructive project that is causing local conflict, and examples of people being killed in Mexico and Guatemala, many others, companies paying paramilitaries, Papua New Guinea, many others. So the Harper government is, I think, very close to the mining sector and very supportive. And we saw that about 2 months ago, there was a private member's bill, Bill C-300, that was voted down in the House of Commons, primarily by Conservative MPs, and a number of key liberal officials, including Michael Ignatieff, that didn't show up for the vote, knowing that would lead to its defeat. And what Bill C-300 was about was ending public support for Canadian mining companies found to be involved in destructive projects abroad. No longer getting Canadian pension plan investments, no longer getting support from Canadian embassies in the different countries. You know, very modest reform. But even that was voted down in the House of Commons with a massive lobbying effort from the mining companies.
Barely voted down.
Barely voted down, but eight votes, I believe. But that's why it was so important that these liberal MPs didn't show up, right? They knew the numbers, and so Ignatieff doesn't show up very consciously knowing what was going to happen. And so a lot of people hearing this talk would think that if we just had a liberal government, or if we just go back to the past, then we'd have a just foreign policy. Unfortunately, that's not my conclusion. In the Black Book and Canada and Israel, the history suggests that there's a long history of support. Canadian foreign policy being motivated by support for empire, historically British, today American, and support for Canadian corporate interests abroad. That's the main thrust of what Canadian foreign policy has been about. The whole business about honest broker, peacekeeper, all that stuff is it's largely just mythology that's designed to cover other interests or imperial aims, if you like. And part of the difference between a conservative and liberal foreign policy, the liberals are better. Definitely, there is I prefer Michael Ignatieff to Stephen Harper. He's less extreme, right? There is a difference, but a big part of the difference is just packaging, right? The liberals are better at packaging imperialism, right? Something like the responsibility to protect doctrine, which says that if there are massive human rights violations somewhere, it's the responsibility of the international community to intervene and stop those human rights violations. That's something that Ignatieff is a big proponent of. Who could argue against that? I mean, how could you argue against Superman coming in and stopping people from being hurt, right? But are they talking about intervening in Washington because because Americans are responsible for 1 million people dead in Iraq? Of course not. Right? We're not intervening. That's not what's on the agenda. It's a tool of the powerful against the weak, right? And it's a way of it undermines legally speaking, it undermines state sovereignty. That's the responsibility to protect. And we have one instance where the responsibility to protect was invoked to justify a foreign policy endeavor, and that was the Liberal Party justifying it to cut off aid to Haiti's elected government of Jean-Bertrand Aristide back in 2001, 2002, 2003, and then militarily intervening to support the American Marines' ouster of Aristide. Right? The result of that intervention in Haiti was thousands of people being killed in political violence over the next 2 years of a coup government. Right? So, far from protecting, it led to a much worse human rights situation and the ongoing UN occupation, 7-year UN occupation of the country. So part of the difference is I think packaging. But that packaging is effective for us, for the Canadian population, and I think even for the international community, right? There's some people are seduced by the things like the responsibility to protect. Another part, getting towards a conclusion here, another part of the explanation why the Harper government's foreign policy is so extreme is because there's so little official political opposition, right? The question of Afghanistan and the extending the mission for 3 more years. That's a Liberal policy, right? That was Bob Rae, the foreign affairs critic for the Liberals, pushing that. And the Conservatives reluctantly going along. Well, that's at least how they were trying to portray it, right? There's a bipartisan support on many foreign policy issues. On the question of Israel, what opposition to Liberals? What opposition to the NDP even putting up? Very little. And I think that extends for a lot of foreign policy issues, much more than domestic issues, right? Certainly, I would like to see a lot more vigorous opposition to the Harper government on a whole series of domestic issues from the opposition parties. But I think that they are willing to do more on that front than on the foreign policy front. So the lack of official opposition is a big part of explaining the Harper government, the way the Harper government can get away with this stuff. On a more positive note, to conclude on a more positive note, one of the reasons why Canada lost the bid at the Security Council was because of the work that we're doing. The work that the Canadian Peace Alliance, the Palestinian Solidarity Groups, the Canada-Haiti Action Network have been doing in terms of exposing and denouncing Canadian foreign policy. And concretely, I experienced, or I saw that in play, where the Canada-Haiti Action Network, the role that we played in uncovering different forms of support that Canada was giving to the coup government, our role in denouncing Canadian foreign policy, a lot of that research and independent journalism that was done would make its way into Haitian media outlets, left-wing Haitian media outlets, and would contribute to Haitian hostility to Canada, right? Certainly politicized Haitians knew that Canada had participated in the coup, but the extent, the degree of that support was not necessarily known. And obviously, sitting in Montreal, you have better access to resources to uncovering this stuff than you do sitting in Cité Soleil or another slum neighborhood of Port-au-Prince. Another example of that was in Honduras, after the coup in Honduras. Notimex. Notimex is the Canadian press equivalent in Mexico, right? It's the the news agency. They ran an article which appeared on about 10 or 11 different very mainstream corporate newspaper websites in Mexico, at least on their websites, all about it was a translation of an article that appeared in Rabble.ca by Todd Gordon about Canada's support for the coup in Honduras, right? So that appeared on a whole series of different Mexican news outlets, all about the sort of Canadian complicity in the coup in Honduras. And then the ousted government, official from the ousted government, then condemned Canada for its tacit support for the coup in Honduras. So that work there, it makes its way elsewhere, right? The work that we're doing in exposing this stuff. Additionally, we know that the Council of Canadians sent a letter to every UN representative calling on them not to vote for Canada because of the Harper government's position on the right to water, on the on Indigenous rights, Declaration of Indigenous Rights, on the question of climate change. Also, we know that the Canadian Arab Federation sent a letter to all the different Arab delegates calling on them not to vote for Canada because of the Harper government's pro-Israel policy, right? So the work being done on that front by different social movements, social groups, activist organizations in this country contributed to the lost Security Council vote. And this talk, it's a grim picture. Canadian foreign policy today, it's grim. No doubt about it. We have this government on high that is making policies that are, pro-imperialistic, pro-corporate, extreme. But I think at the same time that that's going on, we have the growth of internationalism among the population. I think Canadians, particularly those on the left, are more internationalist today than ever. Right? There's actually more international solidarity work going on than most other times in history. So certainly, the Harper government's policy is, we're a grim situation, but at the same time, there's a lot of positive going on in the grassroots, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.